We often look at Hollywood's most iconic action films as if they were inevitable finished products that could only have emerged through the precise collaboration of the director and the story we now know. But hidden behind the official credits lies a different reality, one stitched together from rejected pitches, abandoned negotiations, and creative crossroads that could have reshaped these films entirely. For every movie that made it to the screen, there exists a parallel draft of history, a version shaped by a filmmaker whose vision never materialized. Think of the action films you grew up with, the explosive set pieces, the unforgettable heroes, the cinematic moments that rewired the genre. Now imagine how different they might have been if another director had taken the helm. Scripts once passed across the desks of filmmakers known for radically different sensibilities, stylists who favored provocation, craftsmen who preferred emotional depth, visionaries who leaned toward horror, satire, or moral ambiguity. Their fingerprints almost touched these stories, altering their fates before slipping away. These films did not simply fall into place. They were the products of tense studio meetings, creative disagreements, and last-second decisions that determined which vision would survive. One director saw political commentary, another imagined psychological decay, another wanted operatic action. The studios, trapped between art and commerce, had to choose which version of each film the world would see and which versions would be buried in the shadows of development history. Tonight, we're peeling back that curtain. We're stepping into the forgotten branch points, the moments when a signature, a scheduling conflict, or a philosophical divide nearly rewrote the DNA of some of Hollywood's most influential action movies. Let's explore 15 Hollywood action films that were almost directed by someone else. Fact 1. Die Hard, 1988, the Verhoeven direction that nearly happened. Before Die Hard became the definitive blueprint for modern action cinema, the film briefly drifted toward a far harsher filmmaker, Paul Verhoeven. Fresh off the abrasion and satire of RoboCop, Verhoeven was unexpectedly considered during early development, when the tone of the project was still in flux, and the studio wasn't sure whether it wanted a grounded thriller or something far more confrontational. Verhoeven looked at the material and recognized the darker heartbeat buried beneath its surface. The original novel was bleak, morally gray, and steeped in cynicism, elements that aligned naturally with his creative instincts. His interpretation would have amplified those qualities. Under Verhoeven, Die Hard would not have been a story of reluctant heroism inside a Hira. It would have become a savage indictment of corporate arrogance, built on extreme violence and a bitter view of authority. But the studio hesitated. They feared Verhoeven's uncompromising tone, his fascination with provocation, and his willingness to push brutality to the forefront. Executives worried his approach would alienate audiences and strip the story of its emotional accessibility. As conversations continued, both sides recognized the widening distance between what the filmmakers envisioned and what the studio wanted. Verhoeven stepped away before the film's identity could solidify around his influence. If he had taken the job, Die Hard might have resembled a dystopian political statement more than a suspense-driven action story. McClane could have been a far colder character, and Nakatomi Plaza might have become a symbol of societal rot rather than a battleground for survival. Instead, John McTiernan entered and infused the film with warmth, wit, and grounded tension. His direction shaped Die Hard into the genre-defining classic it is today, while Verhoeven's harsher alternate version faded into obscurity. Fact 2. Speed, 1994. The Tarantino interpretation that almost derailed the bus. Before Speed became a tightly wound thrill machine that rarely paused to breathe, the film hovered near the hands of Quentin Tarantino, then an ascending force, known for razor-edge dialogue and anarchic storytelling. In the early circulation of the script, long before production locked in its direction, the studio quietly explored whether Tarantino might bring his distinctive, volatile style to the project. He studied the premise and saw an opportunity not in the action but in the personalities trapped inside that hurtling bus. Tarantino gravitated toward the idea of chaos unfolding through conversations, passengers bearing their frustrations, criminals and civilians clashing verbally, the cop and bomber locked in a duel of psychology rather than choreography. Under his approach, the film would have become talk-driven, unpredictable, and blackly comedic, less about velocity and more about the combustible mix of people with nowhere to run. But the studio saw danger in that direction. They feared Tarantino's intensity, his willingness to let characters ramble through strange tangents, and his appetite for violence delivered with sardonic bite. Executives worried the spectacle would be overshadowed, the tension diluted, and the mainstream appeal diminished. At the same time, Tarantino found himself unconvinced the premise could expand into the kind of character-centered narrative he preferred, especially as Pulp Fiction consumed his focus. Their paths diverged naturally. He stepped away, and the film shifted toward John de Bont, whose streamlined instincts shaped Speed into a relentless, pulse-quickening thriller. Had Tarantino taken the job, audiences might remember Speed as an eccentric pressure cooker filled with verbal collisions, not the lean, explosive classic that ultimately defined the decade. Fact 3. Alien 3, 1992. The Rennie Harlin expansion the studio rejected. Before Alien 3 became the stark industrial descent into despair that divided audiences and tortured its own production, the project was briefly guided by the energetic, ambitious vision of Rennie Harlin. At the time, Harlin was gaining momentum as a bold action stylist, and the studio believed he might reinvigorate the franchise after the triumph of Alien. Harlin's ideas were sweeping. He wanted to break the series out of its enclosed nightmares and launch it into expansive territory. His early pitches explored new planetary environments, scientific enclaves, and a deeper understanding of the xenomorph's evolution. He imagined a film that widened the universe, raised the stakes, and transformed the franchise from claustrophobic horror into large-scale science fiction. It was daring, it was exciting, but it was also a direction Fox was terrified of. Executives feared that stepping too far from the series' established identity would alienate fans. They wanted containment, shadows, and despair, not exploration, scope, or curiosity. Harlin's vision clashed with their instinct to return to the bleakness of the original. Tensions grew, and creative meetings stalled. Eventually, he walked away, unwilling to compress his ideas into the narrow shape the studio demanded. His departure marked the beginning of a chaotic development spiral. When David Fincher was brought in, he inherited a fractured project already weighed down by competing expectations. The film ultimately collapsed inward, grim, intimate, punishing nothing like the cosmic direction Harlin once imagined. Had Harlin stayed, Alien 3 might have expanded into a richer, more varied universe, opening doors the franchise would not revisit for decades. Instead, the studio doubled down on confinement, and Harlin's broader vision dissolved into rumor and abandoned notes. Fact 4. Mission: Impossible, 1996. Sidney Pollack's grounded spy thriller that never came to be. Before Brian De Palma redefined espionage cinema with sleek paranoia and operatic suspense, Mission: Impossible briefly leaned toward a director whose instincts were far more rooted in emotional realism, Sidney Pollack. Having previously worked with Tom Cruise, Pollack was approached when the project was still an open canvas, a spy story waiting to discover its personality. Pollack's reading of the script took him down a very different path than the one De Palma would eventually carve. He imagined a more restrained, character-focused narrative, where the tension came not from acrobatic set pieces, but from the weight of fractured trust. His Mission: Impossible would have moved at a slower burn, exploring the emotional toll of espionage and the psychological fraying of agents navigating a profession built on deception. But this grounded direction clashed with the studio's ambition. They sensed the potential for a franchise and wanted something flashier, something that could ignite an international audience. Pollack's subtlety and preference for dramatic nuance seemed at odds with their desire for cinematic spectacle. Gradually, it became clear that his interpretation and the studio's expectations were diverging too far to reconcile. When Pollack stepped aside, the project pivoted to De Palma, whose visual bravado and love for labyrinthine plotting aligned with the studio's appetite for a stylish blockbuster. Under his hand, the film became a sleek, high-wire thriller defined by suspense set pieces that would shape Cruise's career. Had Pollack stayed, Mission: Impossible might have become a meditative character drama disguised as a spy film. Intriguing, perhaps, but worlds away from the iconic adrenaline-driven franchise it launched. Fact 5. RoboCop 1987, the Cronenberg nightmare that almost replaced satire. before Paul Verhoeven transformed RoboCop into a savage fusion of black comedy and explosive action. The project came alarmingly close to falling under the guidance of David Cronenberg. Known for dissecting the human body and psyche with surgical brutality, Cronenberg found the concept fascinating for reasons entirely different from what the studio expected. Where Verhoeven saw satire and socio-political commentary, Cronenberg saw a tragic metamorphosis. His interest lay in the grotesque transformation of Alex Murphy into a mechanized enforcer, less a symbol of corporate corruption and more, a victim mutilated and reconstructed into something barely human. His RoboCop would have been a disturbing meditation on identity erosion, where every mechanical augmentation represented another piece of Murphy's humanity scraped away. But Cronenberg's ideas quickly unsettled Orion Pictures. They feared the film would become too bleak, too psychologically invasive, too grounded in horror. Executives wanted a movie that could entertain mainstream audiences, not plunge them into existential discomfort. As disagreements multiplied, Cronenberg stepped aside, taking with him a vision that would have been darker, stranger, and far more unsettling. Verhoeven's approach, unapologetically violent, yet biting in its humor, was the antithesis of Cronenberg's existential dread. His interpretation delivered a film that was both accessible and subversive, iconic rather than alienating. Had Cronenberg remained, RoboCop might have sacrificed its pop culture appeal for psychological torment, leaving behind a masterpiece of body horror, but likely losing the mass audience that made it legendary. Fact 6. Blade 2, 2002. Stephen Norrington's minimalist follow-up that never saw light. Before Guillermo del Toro turned Blade 2 into a Baroque fusion of martial arts, creature evolution, and gothic atmosphere, the studio fully anticipated that Stephen Norrington, the director of the first Blade, would return for the sequel. For months, he shaped ideas for a continuation that looked nothing like the film the world ultimately received. Norrington's instincts pushed him toward a stripped-down noir aesthetic. He imagined Blade navigating a world collapsing into paranoia, a darker, more intimate sequel, focusing on fractured alliances rather than biological escalation. In his vision, the vampire underworld wasn't mutating into monstrous hybrids. It was splintering politically, driven by fear and internal conflict. His sequel leaned into shadows, not spectacle, but the producers craved escalation. They wanted bigger monsters, more stylized violence, and visual ambition beyond the first film's controlled brutality. Del Toro's fascination with creature mythology aligned perfectly with those goals. The deeper the studio leaned into operatic transformation, the more Norrington realized his grounded approach had no place in the direction they intended. Rather than bend his vision, Norrington bowed out. Del Toro stepped in and embraced everything Norrington resisted. His Reapers, with their bone-splitting jaws and parasitic anatomy, defined the sequel's identity and pushed the franchise toward visceral horror. Had Norrington stayed, Blade 2 might have been a cold, atmospheric noir intriguing, but stripped of the monstrous dynamism that ultimately made the film unforgettable. Fact 7. The Rock, 1996, the Tony Scott thriller that turned to smoke. Before The Rock became Michael Bay's thunderstorm of explosions, quips, and sun-baked spectacle, the project lived very briefly in the hands of Tony Scott. Fresh off shaping moody, electrically charged thrillers, Scott was invited into the early development conversations. When the film's identity was still foggy and its thematic direction uncertain, Scott approached the material with the sensibility he was famous for, a texture, rich, atmospheric style, rooted in moral complexity. He was fascinated by General Hummel, not as a villain, but as a wounded patriot pushed to an impossible edge. In Scott's conception, the film would have carried more emotional weight, leaning into the tragedy behind the rebellion and presenting Alcatraz as the epicenter of a slow-boiling crisis rather than an immediate battlefield. His version would have prioritized tension over spectacle, more smoke, less fire. But the producers were restless. They wanted momentum, not meditation. Scott's vision felt too reflective for a project they hoped would become a muscular summer hit. As creative discussions continued, the tonal gap widened until the collaboration quietly dissolved. Scott stepped away, Bay stepped in, and with Bay came a seismic shift, bigger explosions, sharper contrasts, and an unrelenting drive toward grandiosity. The film transformed into one of the defining action spectacles of the 90 seconds. Had Scott stayed, The Rock might have been a gritty moral labyrinth instead of a pyrotechnic showcase, still powerful, but resonating in an entirely different register. Fact 8. Total Recall, 1990. Cronenberg's psychological descent that never surfaced. Before Paul Verhoeven detonated Total Recall with its fierce energy, grotesque humor, and sci-fi excess, the project spent nearly a decade under the shaping hand of David Cronenberg. He dissected the script draft after draft, attempting to draw out the story's psychological marrow, its paranoia, its existential splintering, its terror of fractured identity. Cronenberg envisioned a film where Quaid's journey wasn't a heroic awakening but a disintegration. His Mars would have been eerie rather than rebellious, populated with unsettling designs inspired by biology rather than pulp. Mutations would reflect internal anguish rather than comic book flourish. The tone would have been controlled, cold, and unnervingly intimate, closer to a nightmare than an adventure. But this direction clashed violently with the studio's ambitions. Executives wanted something bolder, louder, more explosive. They didn't want an art house fever dream. They wanted a box office spectacle built for Schwarzenegger. As the project evolved further away from Cronenberg's instincts, he left frustrated but unwilling to dilute his vision. Verhoeven's arrival jolted the film into a different dimension, aggressive, colorful, fiercely entertaining. His interpretation embraced chaos, where Cronenberg advocated dread. Had Cronenberg remained, Total Recall might have been a slow-burn psychological labyrinth, instead of the adrenaline-charged classic audiences cherish today. Fact 9. Lethal Weapon, 1987. Leonard Nimoy's unexpectedly gentle take. Before Richard Donner blasted Lethal Weapon with raw energy and emotional volatility, the studio entertained a surprising possibility: Leonard Nimoy. Coming off his directorial success in the Star Trek franchise, Nimoy was briefly viewed as a potential stabilizing force who could bring emotional dimension to a script already crackling with pain and chaos. Nimoy responded strongly to the characters, especially Riggs, whose grief and instability offered fertile ground for emotional exploration. But he recoiled at the script's brutality. His instincts leaned toward warmth and introspection, toward a story focused on healing rather than destruction. He imagined a quieter film, one with fewer explosions and more character reconciliation, where the partnership between Riggs and Murtaugh grew from emotional honesty rather than shared violence. The studio immediately sensed the tonal disconnect. They needed heat, unpredictability, and danger. Nimoy's gentle approach conflicted with their desire for a combustible buddy cop template. After a handful of meetings, he bowed out, admitting he wasn't prepared to dive into such darkness. Donner entered with the opposite sensibility, leaning into the chaos, the pain, the dangerous chemistry that made the film a landmark. Had Nimoy directed, Lethal Weapon might have been a contemplative drama, instead of a volatile, high-voltage action classic. Fact 10. Predator, 1987, the alternate director who nearly stepped in. Before Predator became a masterclass in tension and primal storytelling under John McTiernan, the film initially teetered on the edge of losing him entirely. When the project first reached his desk, McTiernan rejected it outright, unimpressed by what he saw as a conventional monster chase narrative lacking thematic purpose. That hesitation was all the opening the studio needed to start quietly scouting backup directors, filmmakers, better known for straightforward action than atmosphere. The early script, still crude and stripped of the mythic dread that would later define the film, attracted names who were comfortable delivering loud, uncomplicated creature features. Their interpretations would have leaned on gore and noise rather than suspense and psychological pressure. For a moment, it seemed the film might be handed over to someone who would produce a functional but forgettable action horror entry. But McTiernan reconsidered. Something in the material, its jungle setting, its shifting power dynamic, its subtext of militaristic hubris began to pull at him. He returned to the studio with a vision built on silence, dread, and a hunter whose mystery mattered more than its violence. With that shift, the backup candidates evaporated from the discussion. Had any of them taken the job, Predator would have lacked its careful escalation, its suffocating tension, its almost mythological treatment of the creature. The film's iconic identity hinged on McTiernan's return, a single change of heart that saved it from blending into the mass of 1,980 seconds creature flicks. Fact 11. The Bourne Identity, 2002. Spike Lee's political reimagining that never happened. Before Doug Liman steered The Bourne Identity into a low-key revolution of the spy genre, the studio briefly explored a radically different filmmaker, Spike Lee. Known for unflinching social commentary and emotional provocation, Lee was drawn to the story not for its action potential, but for its themes of institutional betrayal and identity disintegration. In Lee's eyes, Jason Bourne wasn't simply a fugitive seeking answers. He was a man shaped, used, and discarded by a system built on coercion. Lee envisioned a film steeped in political tension, one that explored the ethical rot beneath clandestine operations. The CIA would have been framed not as an ambiguous antagonist, but as a brutal machine grinding its creations into dust. Bourne's amnesia would symbolize profound psychological trauma rather than a narrative puzzle to be solved. Universal balked at the direction. They sought a franchise anchored in sleek action and broad accessibility, not a political indictment. Lee's approach, though compelling, was heavier, sharper, and more confrontational than the studio was prepared to embrace. The tonal gulf widened quickly, and Lee stepped away before development solidified. Lehman's arrival redirected the film toward intimacy and realism, still grounded, still restrained, but far less politically charged. His Bourne ran from his past. Lee's Bourne would have confronted the forces that built him. Had Lee taken charge, the Bourne identity might have become a lightning rod, provocative, polarizing, unforgettable, but likely very different from the franchise that grew from Lyman's restrained beginning. Fact 12. Face Divided by Off, 1997. Rob Cohen's unmade identity thriller. Before John Woo transformed Face Divided by Off into a majestic collision of operatic action and psychological obsession, the film nearly followed a vastly colder path under Rob Cohen in its earliest draft. The story was conceived not as a bullet-fueled epic, but as a tightly wound speculative thriller, one that Cohen initially found intriguing. Cohen's focus was the horror of displacement, the eerie vulnerability of a man forced to wear the life, reputation, and physical identity of his enemy. His direction would have leaned hard into paranoia and existential dread. The narrative would unfold like a trap, with action used sparingly and tension derived from psychological unraveling. The surgery, the stolen face, the stolen life, these would have been rendered as violations, not spectacle. But producers saw a different opportunity. They wanted scale, stylization, emotional melodrama, and a director capable of delivering action with operatic flair. Cohen's interpretation felt too restrained for a blockbuster, too focused on internal torment rather than external spectacle. As expectations escalated, he quietly stepped out of the conversation. Woo's arrival reshaped everything, turning the film into a ballet of bullets, masks, and mirrored identities. His sweeping emotionalism eclipsed the cold, clinical thriller Cohen once envisioned. Had Cohen remained, Face Divided by Off would have been an unnerving character study, memorable, perhaps, but stripped of the grandiosity that made the final film iconic. Fact 13. Top Gun, 1986. The John Carpenter reality that almost took flight. Before Tony Scott drenched Top Gun in glamour, neon skies, and roaring engines, the film briefly passed through the imagination of John Carpenter, a filmmaker whose worldview was colder, harsher, and far more concerned with psychological pressure than heroic spectacle. At the time, the script was still malleable, and Carpenter was approached not for visual flash, but for his command of claustrophobic tension. Carpenter didn't envision Top Gun as a celebration of aerial dominance. Instead, he saw it as a psychological crucible, a story about young pilots forced to face mortality every time they sat in the cockpit. His version would have stripped away the glossy bravado and replaced it with dread, the crushing weight of expectation, the silence before every mission, the loneliness of men trained to fly faster than their nerves could endure. Maverick, in Carpenter's hands, would have been a haunted figure, not a golden icon. But Carpenter's instincts clashed immediately with the Pentagon's involvement and Paramount's desire for a commercially uplifting narrative. His refusal to glamorize military structures made cooperation nearly impossible. The studio wanted an anthem. Carpenter wanted a warning. When talks ended, Tony Scott stepped in, embracing speed, sensuality, and style. The movie became a cultural lightning strike, its legacy built on exhilaration rather than introspection. Had Carpenter stayed, Top Gun might have become a somber, atmospheric drama, still compelling, but far removed from the mythic Americana that defined the final film. Fact 14. The Terminator, 1984, John Milius and the epic that never was? Before James Cameron fused sci-fi horror with relentless narrative momentum in The Terminator, the project's earliest whispers floated near John Milius, a storyteller drawn to myth, war, and characters forged by destiny. His creative orbit touched the film long before Cameron solidified his vision, and for a moment, Milius seemed like a plausible architect of the story. Milius imagined the Terminator not as an unstoppable machine stalking the night, but as a figure of apocalyptic legend, something closer to a grim reaper forged in future warfare. His take leaned toward operatic scale, dramatic symbolism, and thematic weight. The film's conflict would have unfolded less as a tight chase, and more as a mythic confrontation between humanity and its violent future. It would have resembled a war prophecy disguised as science fiction, but the script's budgetary reality crushed those ambitions instantly. Orion Pictures needed something contained, sharp-edged, and achievable, a lean thriller, not an expansive epic. Milius's natural inclination toward grand scope clashed directly with the constraints surrounding the project. There were further worries about his tendency to reshape stories around his own obsessions. Once Cameron arrived, the narrative contracted into something precise and intimate, a nightmare rendered with laser focus. His execution demanded economy, not spectacle, and it was exactly what the story required. Had Milius remained, The Terminator might have debuted as a sprawling sci-fi saga instead of the stripped-down masterpiece that changed genre filmmaking forever. Fact 15. Mad Max 1979. Philip Noyce's slow-burn apocalypse that never materialized. Before George Miller unleashed the anarchic, adrenaline-charged world of Mad Max, the developing script hovered near Philip Noyce, one of the rising voices in Australia's new wave cinema. Noyce was drawn to the bleak setting and the moral collapse threaded through the story, but his vision ran counter to the volatile energy that would eventually define the franchise. Noyce read the script as the tragedy of a man unraveling in a crumbling society. His approach emphasized interior decay rather than external chaos. The roaring engines, the kinetic chases, the explosive collisions, he saw them as secondary. What fascinated him was the psychological deterioration of Max Rokitansky, a man losing his grip on hope as civilization collapsed around him. His film would have been slower, colder, and dominated by emotional weight rather than visceral spectacle. The producers sensed the disconnect immediately. What Miller saw as the foundation of a ferocious, hyper-inventive action universe, Noyce interpreted as the groundwork for a somber character study. Their visions diverged too far to reconcile, and Noyce quietly stepped away. Miller seized the project with manic creativity, crafting a cinematic world built from metal, dust, and fury. His instincts transformed a modest Australian production into an enduring global mythology. Had Noyce taken the helm, Mad Max might have existed as a brooding drama, powerful perhaps, but stripped of the raw, propulsive madness that became the franchise's identity. Bonus fact: Demolition Man 1993, the Tim Burton dystopia that slipped into oblivion. This one didn't make the top 15, but it may be the most surreal, almost happened story lurking in the shadows of Hollywood's action canon. In the earliest, shapeless phase of Demolition Man, before anyone could decide whether the film should lean into satire, action, or straight-faced sci-fi, the studio reached out to a filmmaker whose entire world thrives on the uncanny: Tim Burton. Burton, still riding the creative momentum of Batman and Edward Scissorhands, found something eerily compelling in the premise: two relics of a violent past awakened into a future sterilized of conflict. Where most directors saw an opportunity for explosive clashes and comedic contrast, Burton saw a tragedy wrapped in pastel colors. His vision painted future Los Angeles as a haunting diorama, soft, symmetrical, disturbingly perfect. A place where emotion had been ironed out, individuality suppressed, and society polished into something unnervingly artificial. He imagined Stallone's character as a man stranded in an emotional vacuum, a relic struggling not just to fight, but to feel. The villain wouldn't simply be chaos incarnate. He would be a distorted reflection of a system that had tried too hard to erase its own humanity. Burton's Demolition Man would have pulsed with melancholic absurdity, dark whimsy, and an undercurrent of existential dread. But Warner Brothers wanted something punchier, less introspective, and more commercially explosive. Burton's dreamy, off-center direction was considered too risky, the collaboration dissolved almost as quietly as it began. What followed was a pivot toward kinetic action and broad satire. The film audiences eventually embraced as a cult classic. But in some alternate timeline, Demolition Man exists as a surreal, emotionally fractured dystopia, one that only Burton could have conjured. We've just walked through the hidden corridors of films that could have been projects shaped by decisions made in quiet rooms, by directors who nearly rewrote genres before vanishing from the frame. Now that you've seen how fragile these blockbusters really were, a question remains. Which path not taken haunts you the most? Would you have wanted to watch a harsher Die Hard, a psychological face divided by awe, or a Top Gun stripped of glamour and rebuilt with dread? And do you think Hollywood chose wisely, or did it abandon something more daring? Tell us which alternate version you wish had made it to the screen.